Okay, for my ethnographic interview, I decided to interview my friend Sophie's dad. His name is Marcos Rodriguez, and he is from Cuba. So just a little bit of background information about what it was like in 1950s Cuba, which is when Marcos was growing up. They had two major sources of industry, which were tourism and sugarcane. But throughout the years, the sugarcane trade sort of died off, and tourism really became Cuba's main source of income. One article I read described Havana, Cuba, back then, what Las Vegas has become now. So it was a big spot for just gambling and sort of luxury vacations, and people could kind of escape to Cuba, especially really wealthy people. There were a lot of mobsters who came down to Cuba to gamble and hang out, so that was just sort of the reputation that it had. And throughout all of the American tourism that was happening, there was a large American influence in Cuba, and they sort of became economically dependent to the US, especially as tourism sort of took over as that main industry. But then in the late 1950s, around 1959, there was a military coup, which later led to the rise of Fidel Castro and then later communism. And this resulted in the mass exodus of 500,000 Cubans, most of whom came to the United States via Miami. So a little bit of background about Marcos. He was born in 1957 in Holguin, Cuba. His father owned radio stations and his mother was a pharmacist. But when the Castro regime took over in the late 1950s and early 1960s, the regime really started to repress any form of capitalism and any form of free speech and really emphasize censorship. So that caused Marcos's family to sort of realize that they needed to leave. And so then they relocated. They were political refugees, and Marcos was only 4 at the time. And they came by boat to Miami, where they were accepted as political refugees. And Marcos describes Miami as sort of their Ellis Island. It was where all Cuban refugees had to pass through before they dispersed into the United States, but many of them did stay in Miami, and there's still a large Cuban population in Miami today. And after staying in Miami for 2 years, his family relocated to Texas. So something that Marcos was really open about talking about was race in Cuba, and he was really knowledgeable about this. And he described 3 major ethnic groups in Cuba: white, lighter-skinned Cubans, mulattoes, or people of mixed race, and black Cubans. There's a large black Cuban population because Havana, Cuba, was a huge slave trading importing spot, and he said that almost all slaves who came to the U.S. went through Cuba first. He also described there not being very much of an indigenous population in Cuba. The indigenous people are called Taínos, but kind of like we've talked about a lot in this class, the Taínos were sort of eliminated by way of European diseases and violent conflicts that they had with colonizers. Marcos described Cuba before Castro as being a really racially stratified society. He said whiter, lighter-skinned Cubans were sort of at the top of society, meaning that they had more economic mobility, they tended to be more educated, they had the higher-paying jobs, whereas mulattoes kind of fell somewhere in that middle class. And then black Cubans were more especially poor during that time. But then as Castro sort of took over, there was a mass exodus of the white, lighter-skinned Cubans who could actually afford to leave the country, leaving behind a large population of just mulattoes and black Cubans. And something really interesting that Marcos said was that back in the day, there was a rich class and a poor class, but now there is just a poor class. So he sort of described Castro as like this force that kind of leveled everything out, and now everyone's more equal in Cuba now. He described there being little upward mobility for anyone of any race just because it's not a capitalist society anymore, and there's a lot more racial integration in Cuba now. So Marcos really said that pre-Castro, there was racist sentiments and a lot of just class stratification and racial stratification, but during the Castro regime and after, everyone's been sort of put on an equal playing field. Something that Marcos was really open about talking about was his experience and his family's experience as immigrants. So like I said before, after spending 2 years in Miami, they moved to Fort Worth. His dad had been working as a concierge in a hotel, and his mom was just being a stay-at-home mom. But then they were sponsored by a Methodist church in some sort of like church outreach program, and they then relocated to Fort Worth, Texas to live in that church community. And something that Marcos said was kind of hard for him growing up was that he was the only person of color in his class from elementary school on to high school. So he said that he always felt really different from his classmates and definitely felt a just sort of intrinsic division from his classmates. He said he never felt abject discrimination, but he didn't feel completely accepted. He was hyper aware of his skin color, and he ended up changing his name to Mark just because he was really tired of being different and just he described wanting to Americanize himself as much as possible. So he sort of rejected Spanish. He stopped speaking Spanish. He took German in high school. He didn't really have any Spanish-speaking friends. He just wanted to try to integrate himself as much as possible. Later on, and especially just becoming older and more mature, he became a lot more proud of being Cuban, and that this increased a lot, especially after having kids. He sort of had that drive to reconnect to the Cuban community. And he also said that he always approached being in America with a sense of gratitude. He, even though he did feel a lot different from his peers and never felt totally accepted, he always was just grateful to be in America and to be able to escape the Castro regime and just to have this sort of opportunity to start over. He talked about the American dream a lot and just how he and his parents were so thankful to have had the chance to start over, and that they worked really hard for it, and that they were just grateful for their new experience in America. And he said that today he really identifies himself as racially white with a Cuban ethnicity. And he said that a part of that is just because he has been in America since he was 4, so he's really grown up with an American experience. And as far as religion, he talked about how a lot of his extended family in Cuba were really predominantly Catholic, along with the rest of the country, but he was always raised in a non-denominational way. And as soon as he got to the U.S. and they were sort of sponsored and brought to Texas by this Methodist church, he kind of continued on with his non-denominational Christian religion, but sort of adopted some Methodist tenets. And he said that he's always raised his kids in a non-denominational way, always urging them just to love others and love God and just keep it kind of general like that. And he said that to him, organized religion represents dogma, and that's sort of what he wants to stay away from. And he's always emphasized not loving beliefs more than loving people. So yeah, to him, it's more about just general faith in God than religion, which I thought was really interesting. So Marcos talked a lot about Cuban culture and practices, and how kind of after rejecting Cuban culture in his teenage years, he came back around to Cuban culture and really started to identify more so as a Cuban, and really wanted to impart Cuban culture and Spanish language on his kids. So he did raise his kids to be bilingual. His wife spoke to his children in English, because his wife is from America, and Marcos spoke to his kids only in Spanish, and they still do to this day. Even through texting and email, it's always them speaking in Spanish to Marcos, and his kids speaking English to his wife, which I thought was really cool. He said that they've started visiting Cuba a lot to connect with their relatives that are in Miami still. And this is where they celebrate a lot of Cuban holidays, such as Noche Buena, which is the Cuban celebration of Christmas Eve. He said that they cook a lot of traditional Cuban foods, and they kind of integrate those into their like everyday American diet. So they have a lot of platanos, pernil, and paella. He described Cuban food as having a lot of Spanish influence, so that's kind of where the paella comes from. But something that did sort of bring up a lot of tension in our interview, not a lot of tension, but I could kind of tell that he was uncomfortable talking about it, was when I asked him if he had ever gone back to Cuba or if he wanted to go back to Cuba. And he said that he has never gone back to Cuba because his whole family has sort of taken a vow to not return to Cuba until the Castro brothers are out of power. Obviously, Fidel Castro has passed away, but his brother Raul is still in power. So Marcos said that while there are Castros in power, he will never return. So neither he nor any person in his family, his father, his grandfather, they've never gone back to Cuba. And when he was talking about this, I kind of got the sense that maybe if his family didn't have this agreement, he would have gone back to Cuba, just because he talked about wanting his kids to really experience the Cuban culture. So I could kind of tell that that was a source of tension for him, and maybe he did want to go back to Cuba if he had the chance, but he hasn't yet. Overall, it was really nice to talk to Marcos, and I learned a lot about Cuba and his culture that I didn't know before. And just his experience as an immigrant, I think, is a lot different than a lot of Spanish-speaking immigrants. So it was really cool to learn all about that.